Combining two pieces of fabric by sewing them together with a seam is probably the first skill quilters learn. Seam piecing should be mastered by any quilter, even art quilters. Sewing a seam is simple, but what gets more challenging is how seams behave during the process of making your quilt. I have a series of techniques to make sure all of your seam piecing turns out perfect. Well, mostly perfect. Okay, as perfect as possible. Today I'm going to show you my top 6 tips and techniques for creating perfect seam piecing when you're quilting. So my top 6 are starch, cut accurately, pin, sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, press, and trim. I'm going to talk about each of these techniques in more detail. 1. Starch your fabric before you cut. Starching your fabric. So right here I have a swatch of my fabric stash, and it definitely needs to be pressed before I do anything with it because it's filled with wrinkles. So before I starch, I'm going to completely press this out. I'm going to get all of those wrinkles out. I'm using a hot iron. Right now I'm not using steam. I do like to use steam, but for the starch, you do not want to use steam with the iron. So the fabric is wrinkle-free. So there are a lot of starches available to choose from. You can purchase starch from your craft store, local corner store, hardware stores, even your local quilt shop. Or you can make your own starch. So I am using a starch that I made myself from 1 tablespoon of cornstarch and 2 cups of cold water. And then blend until all of the cornstarch is dissolved, and then put it into your own spray bottle. So I'm going to shake this really well. Make sure all the cornstarch is evenly distributed. And then when I go to spray the starch, I'm just going to mist. I'm not going to saturate this fabric. And then I'm going to use my dry iron to press that starch. And this process can be repeated, which is why it's best not to saturate it, because thin layers of that starch will work better than one very saturated layer. And what ends up happening is the fabric starts to get stiffer, and it folds and cuts with more accuracy. 2. Cut pieces accurately. So the key to cutting with accuracy is to use the same ruler for each cut that you make. And that's true for the entire quilt project that you're making. So you can see here that I have a cutting mat. I actually do not use any of these measurements on the cutting mat. I use rulers that I place on top of the fabric. There's also a lot of different brands of quilt rulers available. Here I have a set of 3 OmniGrids. These are my go-to rulers, and I do use all the same brand because when you stick with one brand, it tends to be more accurate from ruler to ruler. So if I need to cut larger pieces, I can use my larger 6x12 or even larger than that. I also have a 6x6 square that I use, and I have a 1x6 for really small, accurate cuts. Each ruler has guidelines printed on the ruler itself. So here I can see my inches measurements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is not written on there, and it goes the other direction on this side. It does not go the other direction on all of the sides. And then you'll see increments in between those 2 markers. So here I have a line that's the 1/4 inch line. This is the 1/2 inch line, and this is the 3/4 inch line. So if I'm measuring something that is 1 3/4, I can line it up with the edge of the ruler, and I can line it up with this line right here. Smaller increments are the 16ths or the 8ths. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's 8 marks. And this ruler does not have 16ths. Some do, but this particular 6x6 ruler does not. So if I look at my smaller ruler, this one has a little bit different markings, and they're reversed. So you can see that I have the 16th markings here. So I have the black kind of dotted line right here. That's telling me that that's a 3/16. So this would be 6/16, 9/16, and 12/16. And then if I reverse it, it can go the opposite direction. I also have the 3/8, which is a nice feature. So this ruler can give me a little more accuracy. It is a smaller ruler intended for smaller pieces and smaller accuracy. But using these ruler guidelines is very important when you are measuring and cutting your fabric for your quilt. Another tool that I use for measuring and cutting that I absolutely love is something called washi tape. And washi tape is a low-tack decorative tape. It's usually found in craft stores, and it is really good for temporarily marking something. And then because it's low adhesive, you can remove it easily and there's no residue left behind. So for example, I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch square from this fabric. So in order to do that with accuracy, I'm actually going to use my washi tape, because I need to cut a lot of these. I need to cut, say, 40 2.5 inch squares. You could do it by strips. So you could cut a 2.5 inch strip from the width of fabric, and then subcut those into 2.5 inch squares. And I'm going to mark the 2.5 inch on my ruler so that I know exactly where to line up the edges of the fabric and cut. So here I have my washi tape. And it's a little roll of tape. It comes in a lot of different decorative colors and patterns. So I'm going to take a length of my washi tape. It's easy to rip off. You don't need scissors. And I'm going to look at my 1, 2.5. Now I could just use the ruler and go to 1/2, but if I use my washi tape, that means that I will have that same measurement every single time, and it will be easy to see as I'm going through and cutting all of my pieces. So I line that up on my 2.5 and apply the washi tape right along that line on the ruler. And now I have that 2.5 inch. Repeat that on the other corner of the 2.5 inch to make the 2.5 inch square. If I can get my fingers to work. All right, success. So I am lining it up on the 2.5 inch, pressing down that washi tape. And now I've basically made myself a ruler template that I can use over and over again to measure and cut that 2.5 inch square. Okay, so I have my fabric, I have my cutting mat. The first thing I'm going to do is fold my fabric in half lengthwise, because like I said, I'm trying to cut a lot of 2.5 inch squares from this. And I know that I could get 2 roughly measuring 3 inches across. I know I can get 2 from each layer if I fold it in half. So I'm going to first fold it in half. And then I need to even up one side and the perpendicular side. So I'm going to trim. I'm actually going to use my 6x12 ruler for this because I'm not actually doing any measuring yet, but I'm going to trim that off so that it's a nice even line. and that just removes some of the frayed fabrics from that side. So now I have a nice crisp line right here to measure from, and then I'm going to repeat that on the same, on the perpendicular side. So I just trimmed that little side right there. So now I know I have a perfect line here and a perfect line here. And I can use these lines as my starting reference when I start to cut the 2.5 inch squares. So I'm actually going to flip this around. I'm right-handed. I know that if you're left-handed, you do it a little bit differently, but I'm demonstrating it like I am right-handed. And like I said, I don't use the measurements on here. You could line it up and measure 2.5 and cut and cut and cut, but I don't do that. I always use my rulers. So I've got my 2.5 inch square marked. I'm going to flip it around so that the washi corner can match up easily with the edge of the fabric that I just trimmed up. So I have that corner measured off, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this edge of the washi tape, lining it up with the fabric edges that are showing underneath, so that I can get that perfect 90-degree angle before I cut my 2.5 inch squares. So I line up the washi tape. I'm going to show a close-up in just 1 second, but I'm going to line up the washi tape along these edges. So what I'm looking at is the edge lined up with my guidelines, and then this is where I'm going to cut. So I have 1, 2.5 and then marked, and then 1, 2.5 and then marked, and then I'm going to cut my 2.5 inch square by cutting this part of the fabric here. So now I just take my rotary cutter, I put the edge of the blade up against my ruler and just slide down that blade. I don't need that bit anymore. I'm going to readjust this because the ruler could move a little bit. I know there's some tools that help prevent the ruler from moving, that prevent it from kind of sliding around. I don't have these tools installed on this ruler, so it did seem to slide a little bit. So I'm going to readjust before I do that last cut. And then I'm going to trim with my rotary cutter right along that edge. So now I have 2 squares that are 2.5 inches precisely cut. Now that seems like it might take a lot of time and effort, but if you are working on a quilt that really requires precision, doing it this way instead of strip cutting and doing a lot at once will help your accuracy considerably. 3. Pin for precision. Okay, so now I have 2 of my 2.5 inch squares cut out. I also cut out 2 more 2.5 inch squares of a different color, and I'm going to make a basic 4 patch. So this is 4 squares sewn together to make one larger square. So the next step is to pin the fabric together. A lot of quilters don't pin, and that's fine. That is their choice. I have found that if I am making a more complex or difficult quilt that requires more accuracy, I will pin. And I will especially pin when I've got seams that are joining together. And that really helps make sure that points line up and it looks as perfect as possible. So I'm going to show first these 2 squares pinned together. So when you pin, of course, our fabrics go right sides together. So even a small square like this, if you don't pin, and I'm going to move these out of the way, if you don't pin, they can shift. And what ends up happening is they might shift over just a tiny bit. But when you go to develop your quilt pattern and add on to it, that little bit of shift will cause some inaccuracies later on. So even just 2 pieces of fabric, you should put at least 1 pin. I'm going to show how to do it using 2 pins. So I have my 2 pieces of fabric lined up, and I'm going to be stitching along this edge to make my seam. So I've got my pins here. And when you pin, push in from the top straight back. If you push the pin at an angle, it will shift the fabric a little bit, and you'll notice that it kind of moved that fabric up. It's very hard to see, but it moved the fabric up just a tiny bit. So the best way to pin is to take your pin and put it straight through the fabric at a 90-degree angle. So you're going to start by pushing the pin forward through the fabric, and then holding onto the fabric, move that pin so that it is up and down, and then bring it back to the front. So your pin head should always be on the outside, and the point should always be facing into the fabric. Believe it or not, little story, when I started sewing, I did all of my pins like that. And I don't know why. I was young, I was in my teens when I first started sewing, and all of my pins were facing outwards. This causes two problems. One, they're sharp and they can hurt you, right? But the other thing that you want to do is, as you are stitching, you want to be able to pull your pin out. And if you have the pin head facing out, you can just grab that pin head and pull it out as it goes through the sewing machine. If it's over here, it's a little more cumbersome. So don't do what I did. Make sure that your pin head is on the outside. And then I'm actually going to pin the other side of this block. You can see already there's a little bit of purple peeking up. So if I don't pin that, what might happen is it will continue to shift down like that. And that will cause more inaccuracies as you keep stitching. So line up the fabric, grab another pin, straight down, turn, and then connect it. So now I've got my two pins, and then when I go to stitch, and I'll show that in a minute, when I go to stitch, I'm going to make sure that those two fabrics are nice and secure as I'm going through my sewing machine and stitching those two pieces together. So after pinning and then sewing a seam, you press it open, and then what happens if I want to reverse that and make it a nice little four-patch? So what I see here is I have a seam connecting with a seam. And I want those lines to match up when I sew these two pieces of fabric together to form a square. So the key to the accuracy of getting your points and getting your lines to match up is, of course, using pins. So here I am taking the two pieces of fabric, and this is, if I do this a lot, my hands actually start to hurt because of how I do it. I take the two pieces of fabric and I put my fingers, my index fingers, in between the two pieces of fabric, and then I press, I hold the outsides with my thumb and middle finger. And then I kind of just move it around until it looks like it's going to match up in the center, and then I pinch here and I pinch here. And then I move over to that center seam, and I hold it in place so I can pin. Now if I open that up, I will see that my seams are in fact matched up, and if I stitch, then I will have a nice line through there. Another way to think of this, and I think other quilters use this, you can actually kind of pinch it and feel how it moves, and that's called nesting the seam. So because of the way I pressed both of my blocks to the dark side, I can then put those blocks together and the two seams will nest up against each other. And that's a really clean seam connection. So I'm going to use my technique of matching up the corners and then getting to that center and then making sure those seams are really nested. And then when I have my pin ready to go, I personally don't go straight through the stitching. I feel like that creates a little bit too much of a challenge for the sewing machine to get over that. So I make sure it's nested, and then I just go directly to like one side. So I put in my pin and then press it down. And that is close enough to the seam that it will hold that seam in place. And then I come back out to the corners, make sure that the corners do not shift around by putting pins in at the corners of the pieces that I'm seaming together. So now I have 3 pins holding the seam in place, but that is because the center seam can be a little tricky and might shift around, causing an inaccurate line between those 2 pieces. 4. Sew with a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now I'm going to sew my seam, and one thing that's really important to remember when you're stitching seams together for a quilt is to use a very accurate 1/4 inch seam. Now what you'll see here is I actually have measured over a 1/4 inch from my needle. So I've placed my needle down, and then I used paper to measure over exactly a 1/4 inch, and then I laid down a strip of the washi tape that I love so much, and that helps me keep a 1/4 inch seam allowance throughout the stitching of the quilt. So using an accurate 1/4 inch seam is important. The other thing that quilters refer to is something called a scant quarter seam. And what a scant quarter seam is, when you take a stitch, when you take a big chunk of stitch out of fabric, your stitch and the thread for that stitch takes up space. So the scant 1/4 inch is the measurement from the edge of the piece to this side of the thread stitching line. You don't want to measure from the edge to the near side of the thread stitching line. You want that 1/4 inch to be includes your thread and your thread stitch line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch line along this edge. So I'm lining up my edge with the edge of the washi tape, because I know that that's going to be my 1/4 inch scant stitching line. And I've done another video where I've showed how to do this washi tape technique in more detail. I'll link to that in the description below. So I'm going to carefully stitch my 1/4 inch line. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch my line. As I reach each of these pins, I'm going to pull it out before my needle goes over the pin. So now I have my 1/4 inch stitched seam. Five, press the seam. Okay, so after you have stitched your seams, you're going to want to press your seams open. So the first thing I do is press to set, and that sets the seam in place. Before I open the seam, I set the seam. Do that for both pieces. And then what I want to do when I open the seam is I want to move the fabric so that the seam is pressed towards the darker side. Yes, come to the dark side, press to the dark side. When you're quilting, if you're using light fabrics, you don't want the darker fabrics to show through your lighter fabrics. So one of the rules of quilting is to press to the dark side. So when able, when you can, press the seams open to the dark side. I should say that again. Do not press the seams open unless a particular pattern requires for it. So I started out sewing clothing, and I made my first quilt when I was in high school, but I was used to pressing seams open, because in clothing construction you do press the seams open, or there's other types of seam construction that are used in clothing. In quilting, you want to avoid pressing that seam open because you want the strength of that seam to last, and you want it to go to one side so it doesn't pull the seam open over time. So I shouldn't say press the seam open because that's inaccurate. You want to press the seam to one side. So I press the seam to set it, and then I've got a messy area. So I'm going to lift the top fabric just a little bit with my finger. I'm going to get the iron underneath, and I'm going to roll that fabric back. And I'm going to use the heat and the weight of the iron to get that seam rolled back. And then I'm going to just set the iron down. So there's a difference between pressing and ironing. I'm going to demonstrate that one more time. So press the seam to set it. Ironing is when you roll your iron around, and there's a time and a place for that. And we do a little bit of movement when we roll that seam back, but after we get that seam kind of rolled back, you don't want to roll around anymore. You just want to set that iron down and press the seam. 6. Trim the bulk before you stitch the next seam. And this additional step of trimming will help increase the accuracy as you start to build more blocks together. So the way I like to trim for small pieces like this is I use my ruler, and then instead of measuring corner to corner, like, okay, so I need 4.5 by 4.5, I could put my corner here, line it up, and then measure this way. I actually like to go based on the center seam, especially for something like a 4-patch like this. That way I know that that center is going to be in the center of the block. Now, I don't have too much to trim because I've done all of the other accuracy steps, and my square is pretty accurate right now. But if I do want to make it perfect, then what I'm going to do is use my ruler to trim. So on my ruler, my 2 1/4 line is cutting through the seam this way and this way. It's a different way of doing things, I know, but if you really want to get accuracy, I feel like this is the best approach for this. So then I do have a tiny bit that I can cut off over here, just a little hairline of fabric sticking out. So I'm going to use my rotary cutter and just trim that teeny tiny piece. Oh my gosh, it's so teeny tiny. See how little that is? That's such a teeny piece. But could that teeny piece add to your inaccuracy over time? It certainly could. And it doesn't look like I have any to trim off down here, so I'm good here. But I am going to flip it around and do the exact same thing so that I've got the trimmed sides for the opposite sides. So 2 1/4, 2 1/4. And this will, of course, vary depending on your pattern and the block that you're making. But it is a good idea to measure your unfinished block before adding it to your next piece in your pattern and then trimming it to the size that you need. But measuring and trimming if needed is an additional accuracy step. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting from Soliloquy.